Well, it's the second week of Sustainable September, the month in which the Church reflects on the environment. And this week another two news articles caught my attention, both of these ones from New South Wales. The Berejiklian coalition government this week came within a hair's breadth of collapse. Did you hear about this? Came within a hair's breadth of collapse because their National Party coalition colleagues rebelled over the government's plan to strengthen land clearing laws in areas that are habitat for the embattled and fast disappearing koala. Remarkably, this week the koalas won. And the other news article that caught my eye was plans by the same government, by the New South Wales government, to raise the level of Warragamba Dam outside Sydney by a whopping 17 metres. This is a move that's going to inundate over 6,000 hectares of undisturbed habitat that, particularly since the bushfires, is refuge for 55 endangered and federally listed plant and animal species, including the clumsy but postage stamp cute greater glider. Well, the moral high ground certainly shifts rapidly when it comes to doing the right thing by the environment. Incidentally, if you are able to access BBC TV, Sir David Attenborough's latest offering called Extinction the Facts, aired last night UK time, is certainly worthwhile watching. Attenborough warns that since 1970, so over the last 50 years, the total population of vertebrates on the entire planet, apart from us, you understand, has declined by 60%. And over 1 million of the estimated 8 million species on Earth are under threat in what scientists are increasingly calling the second great dying. Well, back to the readings. Exodus today is playing goodies and baddies, isn't it? And it's clear who the baddies are because they're the ones joining the painted honey eaters and the greater gliders at the bottom of the incoming water flood. That was a segue. It's a bit more complex in the Bible, isn't it? Because although we know the people of Israel are the goodies, a lot of the time they don't behave like it. And that's when they regularly get told off by the prophets who pronounce God's judgment on them. The people of Israel are an unruly lot. And their unruliness is nowhere more on display than when Moses leads them through the desert on the long trek to the land that God has promised them. They grumble and complain and argue. They are ungrateful and selfish. They resent Moses' leadership and they won't play by the rules that Moses has given them from God. The history of God's people, in short, is a checkered one. At best, you could probably say, look, we've always known that we're supposed to be the goodies. We've always known that we are supposed to be living by God's laws, whether we understand that as being the law of Moses or the rule of love that Jesus tells us is the fulfillment of the law of Moses. We've always known that we were supposed to be a people of compassion and hospitality and mercy. But let's face it, we don't always live like that, do we? Because this is real life. And sometimes goodies are also baddies. Our priorities get blurred and we lose our moral perspective. One of the questions I posed last week in our first reflection for Sustainable Sunday, one of the questions I posed was, well, which side are we on? Are we the Israelites, those who read the signs of the times, who eat the hurried traveller's meal and then walk out on everything they've ever known, carrying nothing, prepared for radical change in how they live, and opting to trust that the one who created them in love will also lead them through the desert and sustain them as they learn to live in harmony with its arid and awful beauty? Are we the Israelites or are we the Egyptians, desperate to keep the economic dominance that they've enjoyed for hundreds of years, driving their heavy vehicles into the soft sand of the ocean as they give chase to their fleeing slaves, bogging down because of the weight of their equipment and falling victim to rising sea levels, really, wasn't it? Or as I suggested last week, are we a bit of both? Are we, as God's people have always been, a mixed bag? People who desire to be on the side of the angels, but who sometimes, in ways we don't even notice, subvert our own best intentions. What would it mean for us, like the Israelites in this story, to travel light and to trust the future to God, rather than, like the Egyptians, to get bogged down by the baggage of our past and the need to preserve what we have? In the context of Sustainable September and living in harmony with God's creation that is at risk as a result of generations and centuries of human exploitation, it's a difficult and disturbing question, isn't it? And I confess I don't have the answer. The problem for us as God's people is that we're also citizens of the 21st century, with all of the habits of mind and all of the lifestyle choices and the responsibilities and the expectations that implies. We drive and we fly, or perhaps not so much of that recently. We watch our big screen TVs. We live in modern houses. We expect all of the civic amenities of electricity and roads and garbage collections. A recent poll showed that no less than 70% of Australians thought we should have a price on carbon and that we should be doing more to protect the environment. But there's a cost in doing that, isn't there? And the polls also showed that we Aussies are fairly clear that we don't want to be the ones paying it. And that makes it harder for governments to do the right thing, doesn't it? Well, I suggested last week that maybe the first step for us as Christians who care about the future and who care about God's creation, maybe the first step for us is to recognise that our own Christian spirituality is necessarily embedded in the logic of incarnation. Which is to say that Christian spirituality can't be one of withdrawal from the world that God has made. We can't separate the spiritual from the physical because the God who becomes incarnate doesn't do that either. In the very beginning, the Bible tells us, in the very beginning, it is the word and the breath of God that creates the earth and breathes life into all of its creatures. The Psalms tell us that God's Spirit gives life and sustenance to every living thing. Right back in the 2nd century, Saint Irenaeus writes that every creature that draws breath, not just humans, that every creature that lives is composed both of the dust of the earth and the Holy Spirit of God. St. John's Gospel tells us that the Word of God becomes flesh and lives among us. Just as the Hebrew Bible tells us that the wisdom of God makes her home among mortals and pitches her tent among us. The book of Revelation at the very end of the Bible declares, see, God's home is among mortals, and God will dwell with them. The consistent message both of the Hebrew Scriptures and of the Christian Scriptures is that God's own life is enmeshed and immersed in the life of creation. And that means that Christian spirituality is necessarily a creation spirituality. As the great Franciscan theologian St. Bonaventure puts it, every created thing bears the likeness or the similitude or the image of God. And so we are led to God by meditating on the goodness and beauty of creation. That's a typically Franciscan attitude. Seeing the whole of creation, not just human life, but the whole of creation as an expression of God's beauty, gives us a sense of wonder and leads us to see our own lives not as separate from, but as interconnected with the life of every other living creature. And that's, of course, exactly what ecological science is also telling us, doesn't it? That we can't be separate. We live in interrelationship with ecological systems. Amen.
Amen.
Harmony. We need to live in harmony with the ecological systems of the world around us. We begin to notice, I'll get you to help me write the sermon next week, Jules. We begin to notice and to delight in the rhythms of life around us as we learn to show practical care in ways that might seem small and insignificant to us, until we start to notice that actually the rhythms of life itself are meant to be small and humble. If we just recycle a bit more and waste a bit less, if we just learn to use a little bit less water or electricity, if we somehow manage to drive a bit less and walk a bit more, we gradually change not only our own carbon footprint and our own outlook, but in small but powerful ways, we also start to change the world around us. If we as a parish were to install energy efficient light bulbs, which we did up there, it's a start. If we were to install energy efficient light bulbs and maybe some solar panels, if we were to put in a few rainwater tanks, and if we planted a waterised garden, if we planted a few more trees to provide food for native birds, it might not seem like much, but what it would change for sure is us. The reading from Exodus this week got me thinking anyway about who we are and about how much baggage we're carrying. And it reminds us that the stakes are high for people who find themselves struggling in a trap of their own making. We need to think about what God's priorities are and take the small steps that bring our own lives into harmony with that. As St. Paul puts it in our reading this morning from the letter to the Romans, the criteria for our action needs to be what effect our example has on others. And actually the way in which our actions model an ethic of care for creation, that can actually be more powerful than we imagine. Conversely, on the other side, if we as Christians or as the church, if we model ways that are careless of God's creation, then that can give offence to others who do still look to the church for moral leadership. But St. Paul cautions us that the way we live and the decisions we make must all come coherently from a heart that is centred on God. And Paul cautions us too, doesn't he, about the temptation to be judgmental, which is always a real danger whenever we try to change the way we live. Paul reminds us that whatever we do and whatever the choices we make, we are God's people. Whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. How we live then, in other words, needs to have a connection with our eternal destination, which is the heart of God. And the Gospel this morning actually makes a similar point. If we live in a way that is loving and forgiving, then we're able to breathe the air of God's love and forgiveness. If we live in a way that's selfish and closed off, then we disconnect ourselves from the life-giving stream of God's love and forgiveness. God's nature doesn't change. The Spirit of God all around us is nothing but love and forgiveness. But if we live in a way that denies that, then soon we find that we can't breathe the fresh air of God's Spirit. In order to live well, in order to thrive, in order for us to flourish, to live lives that are whole and healthy and in tune with God's purposes for us, then we need to live in a way that's in tune with God's love for the whole creation. So what baggage, this is I suppose this week's question, what baggage do we need to put down this Sustainable September? Because we need to travel together and we need to travel light.